Thank you, everybody, for attending this event. My name is Jari Eloranta. I'm a Vice Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences here at the University of Helsinki. This is an event that we're organizing together with several different actors and scholars, and I hope you enjoy this event. On the behalf of the University of Helsinki, we would like to welcome this esteemed cast of speakers, as well as guests who are here, many from different embassies. We love to see you here. Thank you for that. Also, we'd like to note that, that today's discussion will be streamed, and there's also other opportunities for participating in this event. As all of you know, the road to peace is a very difficult one, and today we will discuss some of those very early steps. We also would like to acknowledge and welcome that we have representatives from different embassies, different diplomatic and international bodies here, and that is very gratifying to see. Also, I would like to mention that this event is part of a new initiative by the Faculty of Social Sciences. We are putting together a new hub on societal security. For us, security is something that permeates all aspects of societal activities, not just something that's confined to a conflict. We will have a new master's program, a new research network, and something that this particular event is part of, outreach and discussions with different stakeholders and members of the public, and as well as experts. So to that event, I would like to warmly welcome you to this event, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion today. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So wonderful to see you all here. My name is Hanna Vass, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all once again on the behalf of the Faculty of Social Sciences. And I'm working there as a Vice Dean and with special responsibilities with societal interaction, which this is at its best. This year is very special for Finland as we serve as a chair for OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And exactly 50 years ago, in 1975, the Helsinki Final Act was signed by 35 member states. And this agreement addressed critical global issues with very far-reaching implications and effects. And it is no exaggeration to say that it ultimately contributed to ending the Cold War. And then, 20 years ago, Finland played a pivotal role in peace negotiations between the Government of Indonesia and the Aceh Independence Movement. And it was facilitated by Finnish NGO, and these talks culminated in the Helsinki Memorandum of Understanding, which ended 30 years of conflict in Indonesia. Today, we are living in the world that faces serious threats to peace and security in different regions, and of course, an ongoing war in the heart of Europe. And under these pressing circumstances, fostering dialogue between conflicting parties is more vital than ever. And this is precisely what we are aiming at tonight by presenting and discussing concept proposals for impartial facilitator and steps for peace project in Ukraine. But before we start, I would actually like to address one issue. And Heikki Patomäki, you are a professor in world politics, and you are a primus motor behind this event, of course, together with other esteemed speakers. And we are now talking about ending a war in Ukraine. Why aren't Ukrainian representatives present in this dialogue? Are we actually kind of making peace over Ukraine?
Well, it would be fantastic if we could make peace today here, but this is not a peace negotiation. We are involved in discussing the steps, the process that are needed for such an agreement to emerge. And this concerns whether we can find an impartial facilitator, what the role of the international organizations, including the OSCE and the United Nations are, and also the basic principles, the framework for these kinds of peace talks. When the peace talks finally start, obviously, I mean, the Ukrainians and the Russians will be there.
Okay, thank you for your thorough response, and I think this is something that we will surely continue discussing when we have Q&A session in the end of these presentations. And in the meanwhile, you can also send your comments and remarks on chat. But now, I guess that it's time to start, and the floor is yours, Heikki. Warmly welcome, and let's enjoy your presentation.
Thank you. My topic is related to this anniversary, 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Helsinki process. Or in fact, it started a few years before that, but the Helsinki Final Act was, of course, the major turning point and beginning of the process proper. The idea is that despite the problems that the OSCE is currently facing, it can still provide a framework for peace negotiations ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But let me start with a very quick overview of some history. The Helsinki Final Act was important in its own right in the mid-1970s as part of the attempt to overcome some of the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War. And it was easing tensions in the 1970s, though in the 1980s there was a new and final spiral of tensions. It brought together not only NATO and Warsaw Pact members, but also neutral countries, and of course Finland as a neutral country at that point was in a decisive position in providing such a platform for these negotiations. Now, more than 30 years, almost 40 years soon, after the end of the Cold War, the world has again fallen into a spiral of confrontations, securitization, and arms race. And this doesn't only concern the conflict between Russia and the West or the Ukrainian war, but it is also a global phenomenon. The China-US relations are very tense, and they involve also a trade war, and there are a number of other instances as well. So the world, in a sense, is increasingly divided into different camps, particularly to the West on the one side, and much of the rest on the other side. When the invasion started the full-scale war started in 2022, it of course led to a very difficult situation within the OSCE, and the organization has been stalled in many ways. And this is also the reason why we haven't seen that much celebration of the 50th anniversary of the OSCE so far. My argument, however, is that the OSCE can nonetheless contribute to building a more cooperative European and world system. And this happens especially through learning from its past successes and failures. Continuing the history very briefly, following the period of détente, there was a new downward spiral in the 1980s. That was another instance where the world was very close to a nuclear war. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was the first real warning and led to détente in many ways. In the early 1980s, the situation was equally difficult and dangerous. However, the OSCE was one of the key platform where discussions about various things could be held also during those days. There were three baskets, as is well known. The first one, the European security basket, stabilized borders and introduced confidence-building measures to reduce the risk of conflict. So immediate steps toward easing tensions in the world. The second, human rights and democracy basket, I mean, this was opposed not only by the by the Soviet side, but also by the Americans at the time. It was the European members of the EEC that were pushing for this. It turned out to be quite important because it was unintentionally eventually aiding the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War. And finally, there was also a basket about economic cooperation as well. It was less successful for all kinds of reasons, but it was clearly indicating a desire for cross-border collaboration. What happened after the end of the Cold War, the conference was turned into an organization. The 1990 Paris Charter was negotiated when the Cold War had already ended, but the Soviet Union still existed. And it emphasized human rights, democracy, and disarmament. In the course of the 1990s, new mechanisms like the Moscow mechanism and the High Commissioner on National Minorities were also introduced. So there was an attempt to institutionalize many principles and also the idea of democracy as well. However, instead of a new harmonious order, this development actually included all kinds of tensions and contradictions as well. And I will be saying a few words about those. The central concept for the new documents of the OSCE was that of common security that was originally developed in the 1980s. And this was central to the OSCE philosophy. The point was to emphasize shared goals and values. Those involved things like mutuality, disarmament, and human rights. But these coexisted with an entirely different type of principle, namely the individualistic principle of state sovereignty. And this led to all kinds of tensions. And in particular, a key tension concerned the expansion of NATO. And this map shows you how different countries at different times have joined NATO, and this process of expansion led to various tensions and conflicts with Russia, and especially so later in the 2000s with some episodes that were like turning points in the relations between the West and Russia, namely the war in Iraq that started in 2003, and the so-called color revolutions of from 2003 to 2005. This, over time, generated security dilemmas, where security was not anymore mutual, but started to be increasingly exclusive. So in a security dilemma type of a situation, actions to enhance one's own group's security often reduce that of the others. And this is one of the key contradictions. Another thing is that the Helsinki process has had unintended consequences over time, both positive and negative. And during the Cold War, particularly the human rights commitments of the Helsinki Final Act, they can be said to have catalyzed political reform in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, of course in the context of the reforms enacted by Mikhail Gorbachev and his regime. So that was an unintended consequence. I mean, nobody in the mid-1970s foresaw that this is going to happen. On the other hand, during the post-Cold War situation, there has been an entirely different dynamics at play. So the Paris Charter's liberal principles appear very triumphant at that time, but the economic policies that parallel those, including the shock therapies in different countries in the Eastern Europe and Russia, led to widespread hardship, inequality, and disenchantment with Western liberalism or neoliberalism. So these developments fostered then developments within various societies, not only affecting the eastern part of Europe or Russia, but in fact also Western Europe as well, toward more nationalistic and authoritarian direction. And obviously that has been one of the causes of the increasing straining of the framework of the OSCE. Imagine a different kind of a world. Let's engage a little bit with counterfactual reasoning. Could greater reliance on the OSCE rather than NATO have prevented conflicts in Europe? From a deterrence theory point of view, one could argue, and it is at least in principle possible, that even greater reliance on NATO deterrence might have altered Russia's actions. The deterrence theory is not a particularly good theory though, and its predictions often fail. And very often exactly the opposite tends to happen. This is based on systematic and expansive historical research on the topic. So one could argue that it wouldn't have prevented conflict escalation. On the contrary, the weaknesses and problems of reliable cooperative frameworks, not least of the OSCE and the United Nations, in fact, exacerbated mistrust and securitization and thus caused escalation. I would go even further and argue that behind that also lies the lack of adequate institutions of global governance of the world economy as well. In the 1990s and 2000s, there were plenty of ideas around, and this book by David Hell and Matthias Koenig-Archibucci is one of the indicators or signs of that, global governance and public accountability. But that didn't happen. So, in conclusion, I would like to draw some lessons to provide a basis, a framework for resolving the Russia-Ukraine conflict to the extent that this is possible in the short run. The valuable lessons include the following. The first is that, like in the midst of the Cold War, we need dialogue and confidence building. These are necessary. They provide the framework for any peace process. Reviving these kinds of mechanisms to reduce tensions and enable mutual concessions is a prerequisite for any concrete process, like the peace process that we are going to see soon, I'm convinced. The second thing is that instead of the inflaming security dilemmas, the frameworks must be inclusive. So the point has to be to ensure that all relevant actors participate in the arrangements. So security has to be mutual rather than exclusive. And this is a key principle of the OSCE. And the third is learning from the unintended consequences of the OSCE and Helsinki process. We also must conclude that long-term consequences are important. So we have to take into account likely consequences and be prepared also for the unintended consequences as well. So learning the lessons of the post-Cold War situation, addressing inequalities and social justice seem to be one of the bases for a kind of a socio-economic basis within countries and in wider regional organizations as well for cooperative politics, both in Europe and in the world. We have to be innovative here as well, because the contradiction between the individualistic aspect and the common security or collective aspect of the OSCE are actually reflections of a similar contradiction in international law more generally. And one of the points is to try to build bridges between these two, for instance, in terms of John Stuart Mill's no-harm principle, meaning that actors are at liberty to do whatever they like in terms of security arrangements as well, but only to the extent that they are not causing harm to the others or cause harmful processes. And this, of course, has critical implications to what's going on in the world today. I'm going to stop here. This analysis is available also in a written and published form. There are 25 off-prints there at the desk by the door. So please feel free to take them when you leave the thing. And that's the end of my part. Thank you very much.
Heikki, based on your presentation, it seems that you think that there is a lot of potential and promise embedded in OSCE. Now Finland is a chair. What should we do to really release that potential and use OSCE power for peacemaking processes? 3 points, Finland.
Well, basically the 3 points are in the final slide. But given the current circumstances and the fact that there are hardly any relations between Russia and the rest of Europe at the moment, I would say that we would need to start with security and confidence building measures. And also with some forms of cooperation, both economically and scientifically as well. I mean, that's the key starting point to provide the framework. But obviously, the point is also to resolve the conflict in Ukraine as quickly as possible. So we need to both build a wider framework in order to enable also the peace process. But the peace process can in turn also facilitate the reconstruction of the common order in Europe and more widely.
So the momentum is here, and now it's a question that whether we can fully utilize it, and that brings Tapio into picture. So I would like to warmly welcome Tapio Kanninen, former Chief of Policy Planning at the UN Department of Political Affairs. And you will be talking about the importance and the role of the United Nations in peacekeeping, military observations, missions, and peace building. Please, Tapio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Hanna, for the introduction. I am at the moment the project leader on the major wars at the Ralph Bunche Institute at the City University of New York. And in a minute, I can go back to the role of Ralph Bunche at the United Nations, where I myself served some 30 years. So after the horrors of the World War II, the United Nations was created to prevent and resolve major wars and many other good things. The question could be asked now, why not to use the UN in assisting to resolve the war in Ukraine? First, let's consider UN's early achievements. In 1948, Ralph Bunche, former US civil rights leader, negotiated the end of the Arab-Israeli war, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950 for this achievement. At the same time, Bunche, close associate of Dag Hammarskjöld, is also considered a father of the UN peacekeeping. In Suez Crisis 1956, first armed peacekeeping operation, UN Emergency Force, UNEF, was established. And Bunche and the UN in general played a key role in solving the crisis. Further on UN's early achievements, in Yom Kippur War in 1973, Henry Kissinger used UN Security Council resolutions as a way for creating ceasefires. Later, the Council authorized UN disengagement monitoring mission in Sinai, where Finnish General NGO Siilasvyö played a major role. Further, on UN's early achievements, 1990s Cold War ends. In 1992, first UN Security Council summit at heads of state or government level. There were Yeltsin and Bush were there, among others. An agenda for peace, a major report by Boutros Boutros-Ghali was prepared, and there was a lot of optimism of the UN's role in the world, resolving conflicts, and this was widely shared. Still on UN's early achievements. Former Yugoslavia war started in 1991-92. Cyrus Vance, a former US Secretary of State, was major UN negotiator. UN Protection Force, UNPROFOR, was established, followed by other peacekeeping forces in the area. In 2000 and forward, a new phase for the UN. 2003, Iraq invasion by the US-led coalition did start without the UN Security Council authorization. Nevertheless, the UN Security Council authorized UN assistance mission in Iraq, UNAMI, in 2003. Interestingly, General Keith Kellogg, President Trump's envoy to Russia and Ukraine, was in Iraq in 2003, 2004, as a chief operating officer of the US coalition provisional authority, and therefore he evidently knows the work of UNAMI quite well. UNAMI's functions could they considered in the context of Russian-occupied areas in Ukraine if the UN peacekeeping mission or UN-run transitional authority of the Russian-occupied areas is established in Ukraine. So the UNAMI's functions were, UNAMI is UN assistance mission in Iraq. They were advancing inclusive political dialogue and national community-level reconciliation, assisting in the electoral process, facilitating regional dialogue between Iraq and its members, promoting the protection of human rights and judicial and legal reforms, coordinating humanitarian development efforts. UNAMI is still in existence, although Iraq has asked it to depart. But for instance, the United States still wants it to stay. A brief note on the similarities of Iraq invasion of 2003 and Ukraine invasion of 2022 from the UN perspective. In 2003, US-led coalition invaded a sovereign state, Iraq, without the UN Charter provisions, against the UN Charter provisions, and without the UN Security Council authorization. In 2022, Russia invaded a sovereign state, Ukraine, against the UN Charter provisions and without the UN Security Council authorization. In aftermath of 2003 in Iraq, still the UN Security Council authorizes UNAMI, UN assistance mission in Iraq. And secondly, the UN Secretary General appoints a special envoy in Iraq, Sergio Vieira de Mello, who in August 2003 died in a major terrorist attack, as well as my immediate supervisor, Rick Hooper. So what is the aftermath of 2022 in Ukraine? What could the UN Security Council do? For instance, UN assistance mission in Ukraine. And secondly, could the UN Secretary General appoint a special envoy on the Ukraine war, which has not happened, and many of us, former UN Secretariat officials, have been missing that kind of action. Then, coming to the question, what are the possibilities of using UN peacekeeping and monitoring missions in Ukraine? First, what are the UN peacekeeping trends over decades? Over 1 million men and women have served in UN peacekeeping operations, and it's used all over the globe. So see the following pictures. This is a map of peacekeeping in 1999. Bold missions still in force in 1999. And this is UN operations today in 2024, 2025. And here is the number of uniformed personnel in UN peacekeeping since 1991 until today. And you can see the peak was in 2015, and over 200,000 peacekeepers were in force, active. And today, still over 60,000 peacekeepers are active. So it's a major army under the leadership of UN Secretary General. So, important question is, why are the UN tools, peacekeeping, monitoring ceasefires, UN-run temporary administrations, forgotten in the context of Ukraine war? Almost no proposals from major global opinion influencers to use such UN tools have been made, but still some. In 2023, in Shangri-La Dialogue, Defense Minister of Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto, now the President of Indonesia, proposed ceasefire, UN monitoring demilitarized zone, and UN referendum in disputed territory. Elon Musk proposed in October 2022 UN-run elections in the Russian-annexed territory. Other proposals by Musk were Ukraine's neutrality is important, and Russia can keep Crimea. But this was like 2.5 years ago. What are the functions of the UN in ceasefires? Basically, two functions: monitoring demilitarized zones and creating buffer zones with either lightly armed or heavily armed UN troops. Here is the buffer zone in UN operations in Cyprus. The blue is the United Nations administered buffer zone. Here is the demilitarized buffer zone between Koreas, established, in fact, under UN command a long time ago. So what we know about demilitarized zones? Cyprus, 180 kilometers long, a few kilometers wide, up to 7 kilometers. Koreas, 250 kilometers long, 4 kilometers wide. What President Prabowo Subianto proposed for Ukraine was withdrawal 50 kilometers from each party's forward position, which would make 30 kilometers wide zone. So finally, coming to peace negotiations, some major issues to be discussed in order to reach a comprehensive peace package in the Ukraine war. And already we discussed ceasefire and its timing. Furthermore, Ukraine's neutrality or not, security guarantees, the buffer zone. These, in my view, should form a cluster of related issues. So discussed together. Then legal status of Russian occupied areas, border between Ukraine and Russia, treatment of minorities and Russian language, lifting sanctions and frozen assets, punishment of war crimes, legal reviews and reforms, reconstruction and its financing, elections, humanitarian aid and development, roles of European Union, OSCE and NATO, and of course the UN. What was finally the message of these presentations? For the resolution of the Ukraine war, the UN has a lot to offer. For instance, peacekeeping, monitoring ceasefires, patrolling demilitarized zones, and peace building in UN-run transitional administration in occupied areas. Finally, the UN Security Council has to approve all UN peace operations. Therefore, in doing so, the US, Russia, and China have to learn to cooperate, which would be very important for the future of the world order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tapio. As you mentioned, UN is currently facing a lot of pressures and kind of challenges to its legitimacy, both from global south and global east, but also from populist leaders within liberal democracy. What would you say is the main reason that UN is not able to kind of fully, same with OSCE, kind of utilize and release its full potential in conflict resolution, peacemaking and peacekeeping? I mean, as you showed that it certainly has potential, but what is the biggest obstacle for that?
I think it's the very bad relationship between the major powers, US, Russia, and China. The achievements of the UN, which I tried to present, are largely forgotten. And they are there. They are just waiting to be kind of found again. But somehow it's like forgotten. And then I guess another thing is that Russia, permanent member of the Security Council, is fighting this war, and many people think that that's kind of forms some kind of exception, that the UN is only dealing with small conflicts and developing countries, but it's not true. Some major, like in Iraq in 2003, the US was there, and still the UN was asked to help. So that's quite important as some kind of major similarity between that war and this war.
Yeah, those analogies are certainly important. Is there something that you would like to? No. Okay, okay. I guess now. Thank you so much, Tapio. Great, insightful ideas and something that we can certainly continue discussing. But now I guess it's the time that we all have been waiting for, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Juha Christensen, the chairman of PACTA Asia. And now you're going to present your concept proposal for peacemaking process. So something that kind of the established institutions that we have been discussing are not necessarily incapable of doing. So let's hear what you have. The floor is yours.
Thank
Welcome.
You. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased that the University of Helsinki has invited me. I'm not an academic, I'm a private sector representative. Anyhow, I have had the rare and privileged role to be involved in Aceh peace process from the very beginning, year 2000, when we started the preparations, or myself started the preparations, and actually almost exactly 28th of January 2005, the parties, representative of Indonesian government, and the Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, the Aceh Independence Movement delegations, they came to Helsinki. I want to share some of the lessons learned that we recognized from the whole process. And I think some of these practices and some of lessons learned are implemented also, or need to be implemented, and are valid for even wars between countries. As already mentioned, the Helsinki Final Act and the preparations for it created impact through dialogue. So like Professor Heikki already, Patomäki told, the first meetings by the foreign ministers were held in Helsinki in 1973, and it took 2 years to come into conclusion with the final act. Now, I will go through and glance through some of the main points of the Aceh peace talks and the whole peace process itself. Myself, I'm born in 1958. I'm chairman of PACTA Asia, stationed very small entity in Singapore, and of course we have a small office also in Finland, Helsinki. I'm also a founding member of Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council, established 2012 in Bangkok. I have 40 years professional work experience from the whole ASEAN region, and I have been living 15 years in Indonesia, 1985 to 1990, and then due to the Aceh peace process from 2005 to 2010. And as I already mentioned, I represent private sector. I'm an entrepreneur, and I have 30 years experience from industry. Here are now some lessons learned from the Aceh peace process. We can't jump to peace process directly. It needs preparations, and one of the things that I'm going to raise up here is the need for facilitators, the need for goers by who take forward certain steps in order that things can progress. I made a very thorough assessment year 2000 to 2002, mainly through internet and reading articles, reading reports and comments. My first visit to Aceh was in October 2002. And in June 2003, I had first visit to Stockholm to meet the leaders of the GAM movement. And it took 1.5 years to build trust with them and take forward the proposal that we should restart dialogue process or peace talks with Indonesian government. And as I mentioned, the Helsinki peace talks, those started in January 2005, lasted for 7 months. Here is a very simple, one of the most simple peace agreements ever made. And I don't go in detail to this, but just wanted to show it for a reason. And here is our late President Martti Ahtisaari, who was the chairman of the peace mediation or facilitation team. And this is 15th of August 2005, when the peace agreement was signed in Helsinki. Now, we concluded certain key principles that were critically important for us to be successful. Number one, it was a rule to both parties: there are no preconditions. Number two, nothing is agreed before everything is agreed. So it's easy to come to the table with no preconditions when it has been agreed that nothing is agreed before everything is agreed. And of course then one of very difficult thing and principle, but we have learned from the history that the lasting peace, comprehensive peace needs still dignity to all. Now, no peace agreement. This is in short the Memorandum of Understanding for Aceh peace process. It will not hold if there is not a follow-up. And the phase 2 is of course the agreement implementation during the Aceh monitoring mission, which was from August 2005 until December 2006. And even that's of course not enough. Aceh needed a peace-building program that I was directing from 2007 until end of 2010. Just very shortly, Aceh monitoring mission, it was a EU-led mission jointly together with 5 ASEAN countries, Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore and Thailand. This is a map from Aceh. We had the headquarters in the Banda Aceh, and then we had 10 satellite offices in the districts. Maybe I can tell that I have been not only involved in the Aceh peace process for the last 25 years, but every single planning stage, every single meeting and negotiations and preparations. Why I say this, I think that I have some knowledge of principles, how peace processes can be started, what is needed, and I will come in more detail to certain findings that we have had. Just telling that Aceh peace process or the Aceh monitoring mission, we had only 250 monitors. We had 150 from European Union and 100 from ASEAN countries. These for Aceh were non-armed, and the reason for that was that if the parties trust each other and they are serious, this was seen to be sufficient. And then we had, of course, certain phases in implementing decommissioning and withdrawal of police and military non-organic forces. And we had the Commission of Security Arrangements, COSA, which was every week meeting and dealing with the security issues and practical issues. This is just telling about the need for equipment and logistics, funding. Now, I will jump on purpose from this Aceh peace process to Indonesia. Indonesia is the 4th largest population in the world, 285 million people after India, China, US, and Indonesia. It's a world number 3 democracy in terms of population, India, US, and Indonesia. Then it's a founding country of non-aligned movement. President Sukarno was the representative 1961 representing Indonesia, forming the non-aligned movement. 1967, ASEAN organization was founded, and Indonesia was, of course, one of the founding countries, having the largest economy far by today. 1999, Indonesia became G20 country member, and early this year, 3 weeks ago, Indonesia was formally taken as a member in the BRICS organization. So I will go back to the Shangri-La dialogue. I have had my office in Singapore for 15 years. I'm participating in the Shangri-La Security Summit every year. And 2023, 1.5 years ago, that time Prabowo Subianto, he was the Minister of Defense, and I would now let him to say directly and address this audience here.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's exactly 11:30, so we are beginning our third plenary session. The theme is resolving regional tensions, and we have a very distinguished panel from 3 different parts of the world, and I will ask them in a moment to speak in the order in which they appear on our agenda. We're really honored and delighted to have General Prabowo, the Minister of Defense of Indonesia, who is attending his second IISS Shangri-La Dialogue with us here. So you will have a Southeast Asian perspective, an East Asian perspective, and a European perspective on the challenges in resolving regional tensions. But may we first begin with Minister Prabowo. The floor and that podium is yours. Thank you very much, sir.
Dr. Chipman, distinguished participants of this year's session of the Shangri-La Dialogue. First of all, it is indeed a great honor for me to once again be invited to speak in this important assembly of distinguished leaders in the defense and security fields of not only the Indo-Pacific region, but also from all over the world. Perhaps I can be considered one of the eternal optimists, but I do not deny that I'm an optimist, because the only alternative to an optimistic view is one that I do not dare to consider. This is, I think, not only my hope, but the hope of many around the world. I would like now also to address the conflict in Europe. That is Ukraine-Russian conflict. I address this because I see many of our European friends present here in this forum. Yes, the Shangri-La Dialogue has been in the past focused primarily on the Indo-Pacific region. But the presence of so many of our friends from Europe testify to the fact that security in the Indo-Pacific is affected by security and the situation in Europe, and vice versa. As I said, our planet has become smaller. What happens in Ukraine affects the livelihood of all the peoples of the world. The price of energy has gone up. The price of food has gone up. This has resulted in much suffering for many peoples of the world. Therefore, I would like to put forward the proposition that is not out of context for us to try to contribute to the resolution of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I therefore would like to take this opportunity to urge, to recommend with utmost urgency for our brothers in Ukraine and in Russia to come as soon as possible to a cessation of hostilities. I propose that the Shangri-La Dialogue find a mode of declaration urging both Ukraine and Russia to immediately start negotiations for peace. This declaration should be voluntary from all participants here representing their various countries. But I propose the general outline of the peace plan as follows. First, a ceasefire in place. That is, a cessation of hostilities in place at the present positions of both conflicting parties. Two, withdrawal 15 kilometers each from their forward positions to a new demilitarized zone. Three, the United Nations Monitoring and Observer Force to be immediately formed and to be immediately deployed along this new demilitarized zone. Five, the United Nations should organize, carry out, and execute a referendum in the disputed territories to ascertain objectively the wish of the majority of the inhabitants of the various disputed areas. And I would like to declare at this present moment that Indonesia is prepared to contribute military observers and military units under the peacekeeping auspices of the United Nations. These steps, I think, has proven in history to be effective. Let us not here put blame on any side. There are always two versions to any conflict. Both sides feel strongly of their righteousness. But for the security of the world, for the safety of the innocent, we have to achieve cessation of hostilities as soon as possible.
So this was an initiative, a proposal in early June 2023. Now, last year, 7 months ago, still as Minister of Defense, but already President-elect, Prabowo Subianto was invited also to Shangri-La Dialogue. And let's hear shortly what did he say 7 months ago.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope you all had an excellent lunch. Thank you very much for returning at pace to this ballroom for this special address. As all of you know, on October 2019, Bapak Prabowo Subianto became the Defense Minister of Indonesia, and almost to the day, 5 years later, on the 20th of October 2024, he will be the President of Indonesia. We are very honored that he's here with us. He's attended IISS Shangri-La Dialogues, IISS Manama Dialogues, a IISS Riyadh Defense Forum, so he's a very faithful supporter of the art of defense diplomacy. It's a delight that we have him here to deliver a special address, and I'd invite him to take the podium and speak in the special address to the 21st Shangri-La Dialogue. Bapak Prabowo. Thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Excellencies, fellow participants at the Shangri-La Dialogue 2024, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, good friends, it is indeed a great honor for me to stand for the third consecutive time in the Shangri-La Dialogue here in Singapore. 1 year ago, in the last Shangri-La Dialogue that I attended, I also proposed an immediate ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities in place in the Ukrainian situation. Since that time, many thousands more lives have been lost on both sides, including many, many innocent civilians. After 1 year, I'm still convinced that my proposal remains logical, relevant, and necessary. Necessary as an intermediate solution to this difficult, dangerous, one might even say potentially disastrous situation in the Ukraine. Yes, Indonesia is far from the region, but we view with deep sadness the humanitarian suffering, the geopolitical and economic ramifications that has impacted the whole world, and yes, has impacted our own region. And of course, let us, as citizens of this world, citizens of this smaller planet, never lose sight of the dangers of escalation, the dangers of miscalculation, the danger of not understanding your adversary, of underestimating his legitimate interests. We must always be aware of the danger of escalation and the nightmare of nuclear war. Once again, I would like to reiterate my call for both sides to rise to the challenge of seeking a peaceful compromise in Ukraine. For the sake of the people of Ukraine, the people of Russia, the people of Europe, and the people of the whole world. I'm convinced that real leaders will always opt for the best solution to protect their peoples.
So, President Prabowo, already 2 years ago, he made a proposal initiative. He reiterated that last year, but there hasn't been any follow-up by any key world leaders or so on. I would propose, and we would urge from our team, that both Russia and Ukraine would consider and invite Indonesia as a facilitator. There are many reasons why we see Indonesia as capable, having good contacts with both countries, but also having very good contacts with other key world countries. I still want to also say that this, from my point of view, my experience, this kind of a facilitator country, I also want to say that we are not talking about peace agreement or peace deal. We are talking how to take steps forward so that a real peace process and ending the war could take place. Of course, it would be very good if the Secretary General of United Nations would actually appoint Indonesia as a facilitator country, because that's also in his powers. Number 2, permanent 5, China, France, United Kingdom and United States. They should elevate and support Indonesia as a facilitator. Indonesia has excellent working, good relations with all these 4 countries. And of course, including Russia, which is also a member of the permanent 5. The non-permanent countries, 10 countries, they should definitely do the same, as we already mentioned, or actually Dr. Kanninen, he mentioned, any peace mission, peacekeeping mission, it has to be approved by the Security Council. We have other global actors, BRICS, EU, African Union, and G20. And I mentioned about the Aceh peace process that a booklet or agreement is nothing without a follow-up. So Security Council should start to make preparations for peacekeeping mission in Ukraine in case, if the parties, as we think would be very beneficial for everybody, come in terms with a ceasefire that would pave way for actual peace discussions and peace process. I have consulted some experts, and many are of the opinion that within 60 to 90 days a ceasefire would be possible to implement if the parties, conflicting parties, would agree on such. And of course, as I already mentioned, this kind of a peacekeeping mission should be launched and started if ceasefire would be announced between the parties. My last slide, why Indonesia? Not only that it's impartial, it's a medium heavyweight country in the world countries, among the world countries. They have been able to end domestic conflicts that they have had in late 1990s and early 2000s. Ambon in the Moluccas, Poso in the Central Sulawesi, Kalimantan, and Aceh in North Sumatra with the facilitation by Finnish team. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our proposal, and we are, of course, available for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Juha. Yeah, this was such a kind of multi-layered proposal that it takes a while to digest, and we shall definitely continue discussing. But just to kind of summarize all three presentations and your thoughts, I would like to ask one question from all of you. And in any negotiations, there is a thing called a resort to reversion point. And that is what happens when a failure to kind of reach a decision has a consequence other than returning or continuing the status quo. And if there is no agreement and a reversion point takes place, that political actor that can actually define the reversion point has significant power. So how do you see the reversion point in the context of peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? And what can an impartial facilitator, such as Indonesia, for instance, do in that respect?
May I start? Okay. Let me first remind you of the negotiations that took place already in March and April 2022. And one of the signs of hope for today is that the parties were able to almost conclude an agreement in a few weeks' time. It happened very quickly compared to most peace processes, and that's quite important as well. I don't see that the failure in mid-April 22 in itself constituted any sort of a reversal point or anything like that. But what happened after that was that this is my interpretation, that Russia decided to annex the 4 oblasts of eastern Ukraine as a response of the failure of the negotiations, and as a response to the NATO countries pushing into that direction. I mean, they didn't actually want to proceed with the negotiations. There were other reasons as well, some of them inherent to the negotiations. There were the Bucha revelations, and there were other things as well. But nonetheless, I mean, that actually complicates the situation today. But this is something that as Juha said, the starting point is that nothing is agreed before everything is agreed. So the negotiations, they start from a clean table, and the sooner we can get to the point of ceasefire, the better. And I think 6 to 9 weeks is a fairly good estimate.
Well, I think in all conflicts, we have some kind of saturation point where the parties are really tired of fighting, and the future does not look good in medium and long term. So the attitudes are changing, kind of the cards have to be played again, and the facilitator could focus the mind and national interest of the parties towards the common interest of the humankind, so to speak. And I mentioned some 15 components which has to be taken into account in a comprehensive peace agreement, and a facilitator can help in focusing the minds of the parties in these kind of interrelated components which have to be solved. It is difficult to do this if just superpowers like US and Russia try to negotiate. So facilitator can play a major role in making the peace more durable, more long term.
Yeah, I would say that it's very critical that the parties have a trust on the facilitator. So it's up to the parties how, for example, they take Indonesia. Anyhow, I can tell to you that Indonesia has excellent relations both with Russia and both with Ukraine. And not only that, President Prabowo made a very big world tour. 1 week after he was inaugurated in October, he met President Xi Jinping in China. He participated in the APEC summit in Peru. He was in the G20 meeting in Brazil. He visited UK for bilateral meetings, and then Middle East countries. So I can also tell that I haven't got any requests from Indonesia to make my presentation. I wanted to follow up the Shangri-La initiative by President Prabowo Subianto because I think it's relevant and it's possible. We need to have different initiatives or different proposals, but we can't define if those will fly or not. Anyhow, I see chances for the parties and of course the country leaders to support the initiative, follow up the Shangri-La initiative by Prabowo up to possibly and hopefully for a ceasefire as a start, and then paving way for real peace process and peace talks.
Thank you, and it's really interesting to know and hear that what kind of reactions this will have in other countries in the global south. And we have actually invited a couple of speakers. And first I have a great pleasure to invite Sandeep Vaslaker, President from Strategic Foresight Group, Mumbai, India. And please welcome, share your views. Really much looking forward to hearing them. And it's actually hearing them.
He's muted. He's
I
muted.
think he's muted, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Good evening to everybody in Helsinki. Can you sharpen your question, please?
Yes, it's more like just hear your views and thoughts about the proposal made by Juha Christensen of Indonesia becoming an impartial facilitator.
Well, I would very much welcome Indonesia to be an impartial facilitator. I think it's possible. I think that it's a good choice if Indonesia can deliver. It is if they are acceptable to both the sides, I think it's a good idea to have Indonesia as a facilitator. If they are willing to do that, and if both the countries are willing to accept, the important factor in any conflict mediation is that the parties to the conflict must accept facilitator, as somebody on the stage said just now. So if they are willing to accept, I think Indonesia has the credentials and the impartiality, and it's a good idea.
Is there something that you would like to ask from Sandeep or?
Well, if I may,
yes, go ahead.
It is very important that the peace process also gets sufficient adequate resources for the process itself and also for the follow-up process, including peacekeeping forces and so on. How do you see the potential role of India in that regard, and other BRICS countries perhaps as well? Because it is very unlikely that the NATO countries can play that role, given that they are, in a way, at least indirectly parties of the conflict.
Well, as far as inviting the peacekeeping troops is concerned, I think the procedure is that at the right time, the UN Security Council will pass a resolution, and the Secretary General will call upon the member states to provide the troops for the peacekeeping operations. So anybody can provide those troops. I don't think there is any special role for any country at all. I understand that that the NATO countries could be in a difficult position, as they will be seen as party to a conflict, but there are 193 countries in the world, and NATO countries are maybe 33 or 35. You have got 160 countries left, so it's a field wide open.
Was this the kind of response that you expected, Juha, or what would you like to say?
Yeah, of course. President Prabowo actually made, during the last weekend, state visit to India and had many talks with President Modi. So I believe that the BRICS countries are in certain way also critically important to support not only Indonesia's role, but overall getting the ball rolling for ending the conflict and hopefully getting started with a ceasefire and then preparations for peacekeeping mission and real peace talks. And I personally think that the peace talks to ending the conflict will take not only few months, but could take even few years. But anyhow, I see personally India having a very important role. President Modi, he met last year President Zelensky, and he told that all conflicts in the end, they are not ended in the field, but they are ended in the negotiation table.
Let's hope we move into that direction. Thank you very much, President Sandeep Vaslekar.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have also another guest, and I would like to welcome Professor Barbara Motta from Universidade Federal de Sergipe. And please, wonderful to hear your thoughts as well.
Hello, good evening to everybody. It's still afternoon in Brazil. Thank you all so much for having me here today and for listening to what I hope can be an interesting reflection on the war in Ukraine and Brazil's possible contribution to future peace talks. As you all know, February will mark 3 years of the war in Ukraine. And as we navigate weird times, as we all talked about it, with increasing international insecurity and with the rise of extreme right movements and political figures with Trump now in the US, Brazil, at least for now, with one democratically elected government that is somehow progressive, and two, with a government that has a special interest in positioning Brazil in major international debates, might contribute to the end of the war. So I will organize my brief talk in 2 concrete questions. First, how Brazil can help with opening the peace process, and two, as the peace negotiations are already in motion, will Brazil be willing to participate in a peacekeeping operation? So regarding my first question, before elaborating on an answer, I need to give you all a brief context regarding Brazilian foreign policy and what have been so far Brazil's diplomatic position towards the conflict. Historically, Brazilian foreign policy fluctuates between one particular divide. On the one hand, on the one side, what we can call the Westernists, and on the other side, the autonomists. And this divide or this debate is a prism that accounts for much of Brazilian diplomacy and foreign policy today. And even though Brazil has traditionally defined itself as a country identified with the West and Western values, it has also and simultaneously recognized itself as a global South country, using this position to claim a significant role in coalitions balancing against a Western-centric order, such as BRICS, for example. And this multiple self-representations poses a challenge to Brazil's foreign policy, since Brazil's behavior can be regarded as ambiguous or hectic. But it can also be seen as an asset, as Brazil can explore these in-between spaces or in-between categories to dodge pressures from both sides, find room for maneuvering for itself and for ending the conflict, and help manage a wide coalition, as will probably be necessary to end the conflict, bridging the current divides. So far, and it's interesting to note that Brazilian foreign policy have been slightly different from the ones of the traditional members of BRICS, including South Africa. And we can identify it through Brazil's votes at the United Nations Security Council, United Nations General Assembly, and United Nations Human Rights Council. For instance, while Russia obviously voted against and China, India, and South Africa abstained, Brazil was the only BRICS member to vote in favor of the United Nations General Assembly resolution of March 2022, condemning Russia's attitudes towards Ukraine, but did so while at the same time criticizing the unbalanced tone of the document. Again, although some might find this position ambiguous, others might perceive this capacity to condemn Russia but engage in diplomatic talks with Putin as an asset. However, Brazil's President Lula da Silva's initiative to create a so-called peace club was not received with enthusiasm, either by Washington, by Russia, or by Ukraine. And my understanding is that apart from the fact that Brazil might not be capable to exert the same influence it did 10, 15 years ago, as the world at that time was perceived as more multipolar and less polarized than now, in 2024 or in 2025, none of the big actors involved in the conflict really wanted or want to sit at the negotiation table. Perhaps we now can see a saturation point, as some of you pointed out, but we are still not sure. With Trump's freeze on U.S. foreign aid to Ukraine and the fear of him stopping military aid, and my understanding is that his administration might be amenable to an agreement that perhaps give Russia control of the occupied Ukrainian regions, the circumstances might pressure, weirdly, but still pressure for a negotiation. And then Brazil's proposal of a peace club might be welcomed. So to directly answer my question, Brazil can help to open the peace process by presenting itself as a reliable intermediary between Russia and Ukraine, and also among China, the US, India, and the European countries. Brazil's collaboration will definitely be strengthened by the fact that it just took over the BRICS presidency, and the fact that BRICS just expanded, including new members such as Indonesia, for instance. However, I don't see Brazil as the one initiating the conversation. Lula's impulse to develop a mediating role in 2023 was perceived both nationally and internationally as out of place. Brazil's biggest newspapers criticized Lula, stating that Brazil was biting more than it can chew. But once the conversation is put in motion, I think Brazil will follow and uses so-called active non-alignment. This was the motto used to describe Brazil's diplomatic position in the war, and use this active non-alignment and use its political capital, especially Lula's political capital, to bring the parties together. And my understanding is that it will gladly do so, since promoting Brazil's mediation credentials is part of the Brazil is back strategy that President Lula has been advertising. And my second and last question, and I will with this conclude, is whether Brazil would be willing to participate in a peacekeeping operation. In principle and in general, my understanding is that yes, Brazil has a history of engaging, helping, and commanding UN peace operations, and Brazilian diplomacy is proud of such history. However, since Brazil's participation in MINUSTA, the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti, the academia and some Brazilian political sectors have developed mixed feelings towards Brazil's military forces' engagement in peace operations. The expectation was that this type of engagement could help Brazil with its civilian control of the military, as well as to develop within the armed forces a sense of respect for human rights. But MINUSTA, the first time Brazil kept a general as a force commander during the whole mission, is seen as a point of inflection. It not only created an image that the problem with controlling criminality in Rio, and an observation, many force commanders that acted in Haiti later acted in military missions in Rio de Janeiro's favelas. So it not only created an image that the problem with controlling criminality in Rio was that the armed forces could not use the same amount of violence in Rio that it did in Haiti, but also reinforced the political capital of high-rank military figures, the same military figures that, when back in Brazil, were willing to actively participate in Brazilian politics. They were heavily present in Bolsonaro's government, our last president, and the investigations so far point that many of them were involved in plans to stop the democratic transition of power in Brazil. And to conclude, although this should be a political concern for the present government, I don't think it would jeopardize Brazil embracing a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine. Rather, I think it would definitely be regarded as an opportunity for Brazil to stand out and also somehow, or to some extent, to remove the military from domestic politics. Some of these reflections are present also in a published article in a journal called Globalizations, a special issue organized by Professor Patomaki. Feel free to access the article, and if you have questions about the article and about my talk, I'm free to engage with them. And yeah, I think that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Barbara, shall we give a applause for your really, really profound and thorough contribution. Are there some remarks or reactions that you would like to raise now? Yes, please.
Well, very quickly. Hello, Barbara. I was just thinking about whether Brazil would be willing to support, in some ways, a process led by or facilitated by Indonesia.
I think it's possible, especially now with Indonesia joining BRICS. And especially because, as I said, Brazil and Lula was heavily criticized. Brazilian domestic elites, how can I say? Brazilian domestic elites are not very, comfortable is not the word, but are not very keen with Brazil standing out in a negotiation process. So I think, yes, I think Brazil would be comfortable, especially now with a large coalition that Brazil is part, but also Indonesia, with BRICS countries, with the BRICS expanded.
Great.
I can only add there, I'm confident that Brazil and President Lula would definitely support Indonesia's role. They met together in G20 in Brazil in mid-November. So it's very much as I think the diplomats much more know it, but it's a lot of the chemistry between people and to the best of my understanding, not only Indonesia as a country, but Prabowo is a very interesting person, outgoing, elevating Indonesia's foreign policy and the role in international arena. So we will see.
I was just thinking that not being negative, but thinking about potential risk if negotiations fail and the facilitator is one to blame. What are those kind of possible consequences for impartial country in that respect, particularly from the point of view of democracy for Brazil or Indonesia or any of that matter? How do you see those potential risks?
I think the risks are high, especially with Brazil having a history of being a reliable third party. And I think Brazil's diplomacy, as I said, is proud of this history. And two, I think Lula's political capital would be somehow diminished if Brazil would put itself in the front of this negotiation, and putting itself in the front of this negotiation, this negotiation failed somehow. I think this happened a little bit with Brazil's initiative with Turkey to engage in a treaty, in the nuclear treaty with the US. I think this somehow happened already with Brazil. And I think Brazil would be willing to engage in the negotiation, but in a bigger coalition, because in a bigger coalition, if the negotiations fail, Brazil would not be the only to blame.
Yes, go ahead.
You raised this question that if negotiations fail, but the key point is that we have to keep negotiating. Even if first negotiations fail, there has to be some other aspects and forums to do it, because we are very quickly approaching a nuclear level or nuclear confrontation if this kind of hostility is going on and on for years and years. And so we cannot stop trying.
Yeah, comparing different types of risks, obviously. Yes,
yeah,
go ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That would be my point as well, that compared to the risks of escalation, I mean, the risk of failure in this kind of a negotiation is very, very minor.
Definitely right. Hey, thank you so much, Barbara Motta, and it was such a pleasure to having you here.
Thank you.
Now I think it's another time that everybody have been waiting for, so let's open the floor for joint discussions, plenum discussions, and we have Isabel Dinan, a student at our faculty, and just please raise your hands and ask for a floor. And we can have a couple of questions in row, and then we will address them jointly. So please, the first, and please also present yourself. Pardon?
Identify yourself.
Yes, identify yourself kindly.
Thank you so much. My name is Mohammed Ghunim, and I am the ambassador of Egypt to Finland. So since I am the first speaker, I would have to thank the University of Helsinki and the Faculty of Social Sciences for giving us this opportunity. And I would have to start by mentioning that I totally agree with President Barbo concerning what he said about the magnitude of this conflict and its consequences, that it's hitting like regions beyond the region where it is, and that this conflict in Ukraine is affecting regions. I come from Egypt, and I never thought that would be that much affected there. And that takes us to the point where that we have to find a way to solve this problem. And in my point of view, solving this problem, the problem of solving this problem doesn't lie in the content, because the content is the decision of the parties to the conflict. It relies with logistics. And as mediators, we have to find a way to solve the problem of organization of the process of solving the problem, and about the sequence of dealing with solving the problem. As a matter of fact, I have a master's degree in crisis management, and I registered for a PhD in negotiations, and my topic was deadlocks in negotiations and the role of third party. So this is exactly a case study for what I have started working on. So the thing is that the solution that the president had presented is, in my point of view, like a classical model of what we used to see as conflict resolution, where you bring the two parties and they shake hands together and take some pictures and then implement some troops and so on. No, in my point of view, this is a hybrid kind of conflict. This is a conflict that we have never seen before, in my point of view. It's hybrid, it's got conventional weapons, it's got potential of using non-conventional weapons, it's got IT with it, it's got technology with it, it's got shadow fleet, and it's got so many things. This is not the usual thing that we have seen. That's why we have to find solutions for that in an unusual way as well. The question about the players, the UN can play a role. State actors can play a role. Non-state actors can play a role. As a matter of fact, the problem that we face now, if someone is playing a role, the usual dilemma that we used to learn when we were studying the international law, that the international law hasn't got teeth to bite. So how will you implement what you will come to? In my point of view, the role of the United Nations comes after finding a solution, not before. And we have tried that in several places. Maybe we can start with the state players. A country like Finland, for instance, with its role in Ireland, has a great experience. But what we need is a face that's acceptable to both parties there. And here, we can see Indonesia, we can see Brazil, and so on. And by the way, concerning the BRICS voting for the resolution against the Russian aggression, no, there was Egypt and South Africa that voted. It was not only Brazil that voted for that. There were other countries there. So maybe I disagree with our Brazilian colleague. So anyways, I don't want to talk a lot, but I wanted maybe to share some ideas and to put some food for thought from my personal point of view. I'm not talking within my official capacity here. I'm talking as a scholar, as much as I like to think of myself. And to conclude concerning that non-state actors think, universities can have a role, think tanks can have a role, research centers can participate in that. And I think that combining a group or a task mission of several actors together can come to a resolution or a solution to the conflict, and can put pressure as well in order to implement this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. So multiple players, multiple layers. Yes, please.
Yes, hi. Ambassador Tomasz Chłoń, Polish Embassy in Helsinki. And 3 points. First, thank you for organizing this, because we here and in Europe are so much, Eurocentric, Euro-focused, and to hear the voices, from Indonesia, from India, from Brazil is very important, and thank you for that. My second point is that when we suggest solutions, when we advise Ukraine, when we address Russia, we should bear in mind who is aggressor and who is a victim. So I think, first of all, we should listen to what the victim of this war of aggression thinks. And my third point is, because it is important for how to end the war, the assumption that I heard in the first presentation and that I would like to challenge, and that is that the NATO enlargement escalated the security situation in Europe. I could argue the reverse. The enlargement of NATO de-escalated the security perception. If you look at the history of the Central Europe, tensions between the nations, all of them now being members of NATO, is a unique historical situation. And I think that in Finland's and Sweden's accession to NATO has been also considered here as a de-escalatory move. Thank you.
Thank you. The role of NATO and enlargement, I can see that Heikki is about to burst to respond, but let's have one more question and then we can address these all together or comments. So please. And then one behind. Yeah, of course.
Hello, I'm Maxim Kravchuk from the Embassy of Ukraine. So my task is very complicated now to respond to everything was talked today. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for these interesting ideas. And I would like to start with expressing gratitude to Polish ambassador for his brilliant comment, reminding us who is aggressor here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask you kindly to remember one thing. There is no conflict in Ukraine. There is no war in Ukraine. There are no conflicting parties of something. There is illegal, unprovoked, full-fledged invasion started in 2022, and the aggression started in 2014. And we are forgetting that this war lasted 11 years. And before full-fledged invasion started, you remember that it will be the final point of almost 7 years of peace process, more than 20 ceasefire agreements, a lot of talks, 200 rounds of talks. What we are talking about? Now we are repeating ourselves. We need to understand what the interest of the aggressor here and whether the aggressor is ready to stop this aggression. So I don't want to remind again who is victim here. We need to remember that the only one condition to return a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in Europe, is accountability of Russia for more than 100,000 of war crimes, numerous crimes against humanity, genocide, and crime of aggression. Only after that we can talk about something like a lasting peace. It's not about ceasefire only or stopping temporarily this war, because the interest of Russia to occupy part of Ukraine and they occupy the other parts of Ukraine. And it's openly stated by the Russian leadership. And I would like to remind one more thing, that Ukraine doesn't have disputed territories with Russia. So what kind of referendums you are planning to conduct? Under the barrels of guns, as it was in Crimea after attempted annexation of Crimea. So here we need to be very delicate and remember several things. First and foremost, accountability and restoration of justice. By the way, the peace process started 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, with proposed by President Zelensky peace formula, which consists of 10 points, which meets all concerns raised today: food security, energy security, nuclear safety, environmental safety, restoration of justice, and other points. So the only thing we need to talk about how we restore respect to UN Charter, then United Nations would be reinvent itself, because we need to restore the respect to fundamental rules of game. So can we reconfirm this commitment of all parties? And by the way, let's remember that last year we had a global peace summit in Switzerland, which started a real talk. What, not conditions, but what preconditions, and only precondition to end this war is to stop the aggressor with a full isolation and creating the conditions when this aggressor doesn't pose the threat to the whole world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. And let's have another round of questions, but let's respond first. And let's start in reverse order. So addressing these really valuable points. And maybe, Heikki, you would like to start.
Well, war itself constitutes further obstacles to peace. When there's a prolonged war, like in this case, I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of victims on both sides. And on the Ukrainian side, there are also tens of thousands of civilians, plus millions who have been forced to relocate and so on. Obviously, this creates a lot of hatred, a lot of bitterness. And also on the Russian side, I would say that there are these people that are permanently handicapped because of the war, not to speak of all those casualties, I mean, those people who have actually died in the war. And that creates bitterness on the Russian side as well. Nonetheless, I mean, this war is not going to end by military activities. It will end by some kind of a peace process that includes negotiations, dialogue, and eventually an agreement. So what we have been trying to think about here are what are the necessary steps for us to achieve the beginning of that kind of a process. Also, I think there's a very strong argument to be made in favor of prioritizing the stopping of further suffering of the Ukrainian people. And so the war has to stop. And so I think the idea of impartial facilitator, the idea that nothing is agreed before everything is agreed, I mean, allows for all kinds of grievances to be articulated into negotiations, but at the same time there has to be also some idea that what kind of a positive outcome could actually conclude this war, which is not only a war between Russia and Ukraine, but it's also a war that threatens the security of the entire world in many ways. And from that perspective, I think it's quite important that today we have heard people from Indonesia, India, and Brazil, and so on, and also Egypt as well, that this is a concern of the whole of humanity, not only of Ukrainians and Russians. And to respond to your point about unconventional means, I totally agree, and one way of looking at this event here is in terms of track 2 diplomacy, that we are trying to do something in terms of civil society, academia, experts, people who have contacts to various parties, etc. And to propose alternative solutions. I think the Indonesian proposal is a good starting point, but I mean, it's only an opening. And then other ideas, further ideas can be also brought to the negotiations as the time comes. And one of the ideas that we've been entertaining is the possibility of using the concept of international temporal administration for some parts of the eastern Ukraine, to give time for things to settle, to re-establish rule of law, and also the welfare of people who are actually living there and so on, but without actually giving the territories in a permanent manner to either party at the outset. And then over time, their fate will be decided on the basis of both diplomatic negotiations and on some kind of a referendum as well.
I think Ambassador of Egypt mentioned, if I understood correctly, that states and maybe state coalitions and non-states negotiate first agreement on wars like this war, and the UN comes only afterwards. But I don't think this gives an accurate picture of the situation over the decades. This Secretary General Antonio Guterres is relatively passive in terms of taking initiatives, but other UN Secretary Generals have taken a kind of number of initiatives behind the scenes. Ralph Buncham, I mentioned, Dag Hammarskjöld, Kofi Annan, and others. When I was at the UN, I was heading a conflict prevention system at the UN system, and we tried to prevent a war before they start emerging. And in many cases, we were quite successful. And I think the bottom line here is that the situation in Ukraine is getting so difficult in terms of that we are getting closer and closer to a nuclear escalation because all this disarmament and hotline arrangement have been disbanded, and we are really in a difficult situation, and we just have to get serious about preventing a nuclear war.
Juha, what are your thoughts?
As we had preparation meetings, we all three agreed that Indonesia's and Prabowo's initiative proposal was valid and valid today. It really matters that things could be started taking the first step, and very often you need a facilitator to convince the parties, each of them, and bring them closer. And I think we fully agree that Indonesia is one of the best options and proposals for this kind of a role. Second thing, when we had our discussions and preparations, we also fully agreed that the United Nations and United Nations Security Council is critically important, especially when it comes to peacekeeping mission. Now, just referring, I'm very happy that you mentioned President Prabowo. He was in Egypt 16, 17, 18th of December for the D8 meetings, and meeting also President Sisi. So I don't have any other things to say. Pragmatic, small steps, and I want to reiterate once again that we don't have a peace agreement on the table. We don't have other than how to initiate, how to trigger that elements or progress can be achieved in ending the war in Ukraine.
Thank you, Juha. Let's have a couple of very compact comments and then a round of concluding remarks. I can see Sonia Amade's hand for you.
Sonia Amade, World Politics, here at University of Helsinki. This was an amazing discussion. Thank you to everyone. I'm just wondering, nobody really mentioned the United States' buy-in with the Trump administration. And do you think all of this can move forward relatively successfully by not really getting the US on board, or is it necessary to get President Trump, for example, or his team to nod in this direction? Just your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Sonia. Yeah, the role of US is definitely something we want to address. And then I saw one more hand, and maybe... Yes, please, in the front.
My name is Ivan Pauzin. I am the first secretary of the Embassy of the Russian Federation here in Helsinki, in Finland. I didn't plan to speak, but in any case, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Hanna Vass and the distinguished speakers for organizing this event. and for speaking on such a delicate and hard topic. I really liked the presentations. Some of the ideas were unfortunately not new, but some of them were very interesting and definitely worth of taking a look at. I will refrain from commenting on some statements made by a couple of guests here in the hall, but unfortunately, due to my position, well, I'm not in the position to elaborate on my capital's position of principle on Ukrainian peace settlement matter, but I believe it is widely well known. Our president, Vladimir Putin, has put it forth on many occasions. Those of you who might not know, they might look at the Valdai International Conference or the direct telephone line that was held a month ago. I have just one question to the distinguished speakers, just from an academical, let's say so, from an academical point of view, how would you assess the situation when one leader, Zelensky, for example, when he makes a decree forbidding himself to hold any kind of peace talks with Russia? Like, this is historically speaking unique, and what do you think might be the consequences of it? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let's start from that and then the role of US and have one round of concluding remarks. So everything you want to say, please say it now and in a couple of minutes.
Very quickly, yes. Sonia's question first, and they are actually connected. I think the Trump administration's Ukraine policy, which may be quite ambiguous and unpredictable, but nonetheless is opening a window of opportunity for peace talks to start. I mean, there's not only pressure on the Ukrainian part, but also attempt to create some kind of a dialogue with Russia as well. And in a way, this is about how to seize the opportunity under the circumstances. But I don't think that this can be resolved by bilateral talks between the US, Russia, Ukraine, but I mean, it actually requires a proper peace process. And then all the things that we have considered here are relevant. Impartial facilitator, the role of international organizations, the OSCE, and the United Nations in particular. But this is also in part an answer to your question as well. Of course, given all this frustration and bitterness that the prolonged war has created, there might be reluctance to engage with negotiations. But I mean, the time always comes when the negotiations start. And this might be the moment when we can see that opportunity or window to actually open.
Well, as I said earlier, we are reaching a kind of saturation point in the Ukraine war, and peace talks are starting. There is more seriousness in that. And of course, major players are making their opening statements, and then they're making another statements which are a little bit modified. And so their positions will change. And that's quite normal in peace negotiations, if we are really serious in peace negotiations. So this is a very dynamic situation, and quite a number of things are going to change very quickly.
Yeah, I would like to comment the role of US. US is, of course, needed. But I don't think that US alone can bring peace or end the war or the conflict. We have 4 fault lines. We have fault line not only between Russia and Ukraine, but we have fault line between NATO and Russia. We have fault line between European Union and Russia, and we have fault line also between US and Russia. So I don't think that, you know, the whole complexity of these fault lines can be only solved by one party. China is definitely very important for many, many reasons. We have some other big actors. We have the UN, which are needed. And once again, I say, I fully believe that actually deep in their hearts and minds, both leaders of Russia and Ukraine, they actually are dreaming or thinking or hoping that the conflict could be brought into an end. So many people say I'm over-optimistic, but I think we need to be over-optimistic in order to reach the level of what is reality in optimistic thinking. I want to end my comment referring to Wali Nangro Malik Mahmud, who was the leader of GAM movement. He said the Helsinki Peace Accord was only possible due to the fact that we had the right people at the right time in the right place. And from my perspective, not being an academic, being a pragmatic person, having some reference and experience, I think we have a momentum. And I want to believe on that. And I want to push with my small role and position these initiatives forward in those circles that I'm engaged with.
Thank you, Juha. Yeah, I think this evening has been a very vivid reminder how difficult issues, war and disarmament and resolution and negotiations and monitoring and facilitation are. And at the same time, it has also reminded us how difficult it is to think about concrete proposals instead of just having very grim kind of prospects or dystopian views about the future. And it has also reminded us that peace is always something that we should be reaching into. And peace is always possible to achieve with these existing measures and existing organizations and institutions and players that are already at our disposal. So what we should be doing is to learn from past, learn from empirical processes that we have been witnessing, and then combine those experiences with in-depth theoretical knowledge that universities and other institutions can produce. And that is something that can be achieved when academia and practitioners come together, as we have done today, of course, combined with in-depth knowledge from foreign affairs. So I think that we have learned a lot, and this is, of course, a very baby step, but still something to move forward with. So my warm thanks once again, Heikki Patomäki, Tapio Kanninen, and Juha Christensen, Sandeep Vaslaker, and Barbara Motta, that we had a pleasure of joining. And then I would like to thank all of you who have been present here at the Think Corner, and all of those of you who have watched this online. So thank you so much, and let's move towards peace. Thank you, and have a good evening.